Okay. Hi everyone, Hanno the Honda Mäkinen here. Today I thought I'd do something different, and I thought I'd talk about what are my favorite seasons of Formula One. So decide, but I have thought about this topic considerably, and I have actually come to the conclusion that from 2007 until 2010, those 4 seasons are my favorite Formula One seasons. And I'm going to talk about in the stream why that is. Okay, what I was trying to do was to have every year they do a sort of a school photo of all the Formula One drivers at the start of the season and all through the season. And I was trying to get 2007 and 2009. 2007 and 2010, but now that I look at this photo a bit more closely, I realized that this has to be from either 2009 or 10, or 2009 or 8, 2009. So sorry, screwed that up right from the get-go. But I do have some actual pictures from 2010 at the end of this. Okay, but just to set the scene, just so we don't jump into this straight, like cold turkey or anything, let's talk about what led up to those years and why I thought those years were so interesting. And so, what happened in 2006? Well, at the end of the 2006 season, Michael Schumacher retired from Formula One temporarily, but he did retire. And the reason for his retirement was that it was the second year in a row that he lost to this guy. This happy fellow here is Fernando Alonso, and this was after he won his second championship with Renault. And this caused a big shift in Formula One because I think everybody knows that Michael Schumacher was kind of a big deal. You know, won 5 straight championships with Ferrari, and then earlier in the 90s he had won 2 championships with Benetton. But from 2000 till 2004, he was absolutely completely unchallenged for the championship. It just completely dominated everything. And then Alonso finally broke the streak in 2005 and 2006. And during that time, you know, for those first couple of years when he was in the 2000s, Schumi's obvious sort of rival for the championship was a certain Finnish driver. His name was Mika Häkkinen, who was a double champion for driving for McLaren. But after the first couple of years, Häkkinen finally retired, and he was replaced by another Finnish driver, this guy down here. So Räikkönen was going up against Schumi during those years, but McLaren was just plagued by terrible luck, or just you know, they could never really fight Ferrari on the track because McLaren just suffered from extremely unreliable cars. And there were some years that Kimi wasn't even like the runner-up necessarily. So that also opened up the window for Alonso. And then in 2005, 2006, Alonso capitalized those opportunities. Won the championship twice in a row. So when Schumi left, that of course created a huge vacuum. There was suddenly a seat open at Ferrari. And that seat went to this guy, Kimi. And when Kimi left McLaren, that of course left a seat open at McLaren. And that seat went to this guy. So when we now come to 2007, now there's a lot to unpack here. I have most of these are going to be pretty crowded with photos. So Alonso moved to McLaren, and here is Alonso at McLaren. And yeah, so 2007, that was the season Kimi Räikkönen won the championship. His first season at Ferrari, he won the championship. So obviously 2007, you can probably guess, is a big deal for Finnish F1 fans because of that. But it was also quite an unusual championship because even though he went to Ferrari, Kimi, shockingly, was not the favorite to win the championship that year. No. And would have guessed because of the past 2 years that Fernando Alonso was probably the champion. Probably the favorite to win the championship. What Alonso and Räikkönen did not suspect that there was this guy showing up. So this is Lewis Hamilton. Obviously now people know who he is. Back then, he was a relatively unknown name. in Formula One because 2007 was his rookie season. That's right. He came into Formula One's. In case you don't know, most of the time when drivers come into Formula One, they have to start off at a smaller team. Kimi, for instance, started at Sauber, which is Alfa Romeo now, which is ironically where he's actually driving right now. And Fernando, he obviously drove quite a few years for Renault, but he also drove for another team called Minardi, which is now called Toro Rosso. So usually you start from the lower end of the pecking order, and then you build your way up to the big teams. And Hamilton came into the sport directly into a championship challenging team, and he got very, very close. He dominated a good bunch of the season. He showed everybody that he was really quick right from the get-go. And Hamilton was absolutely the favorite to win the championship, which would have been unprecedented, completely shocking. And it would have happened if not for the very end of the season. Hamilton started having a lot of bad luck at races. He kept making a lot of mistakes where he had to retire from races, ended up not getting so many points. It allowed the rest of the field to catch up. And Kimi won that championship by just 1 point. So it was a very, very, dramatic end to the season, especially because Kimi was not really expected to win. And it was a shocker, especially for this guy, who thought he was coming into McLaren being the reigning champion, and he was obviously going to be the number one driver. And now there's this new kid called Lewis on the block who's kicking his ass till next Tuesday. So you can understand that this set of circumstances had a lot of, shook up the whole world of Formula Ones in a big, big way. Well, so you would probably guess that this would be like my absolute favorite year for Formula Ones. It isn't, shockingly, but it was an interesting year. I'll talk about a little bit about these other pictures because these are just fun pictures. So this handsome guy over here is Robert Kubica. So this was the first full season Kubica drove as a Formula One driver. Kubica was a really, really good driver. So yeah, I put this picture in because this is the old Robert that everybody. He drove this year, of course, in Formula Ones for Williams, and yeah, that was not good. That was not good. And then I had to put in this cute little picture of this orange little car. The orange little car that I could. This is a Spiker F1 car. Spiker is a team that only existed for this season. Technically, at the very end of 2006, they bought out another team, which was the British Midland F1 team, owned obviously by the airline company. And they were a team that were not doing so well in 2006, and they didn't do very well in 2007. I think they scored points maybe in one race. Adrian Sutil, who is a German driver whose career ended up having kind of a tragic end. He didn't die, but yeah, it was kind of like he had kind of a bad ending to his career. So 2007, this team was under the Spiker name. Spiker is a Dutch car company, which is why the orange coloration. And by the way, I love orange F1 cars. So this is why I love the current McLarens. Because they have the orange coloring. And before this, there was a team called Arrows that had orange cars. I just like this. Then the following year, this team, because the Spiker team did so badly in 2007, the Spiker car company sold the team off, and it became Force India, which is now Racing Point, and they are the ones that have the really cool-looking pink cars. I'm not trying to be facetious. I actually think that the pink cars are really cool, because I think most F1 cars look a bit boring because they all use the same colors. But yes, there was another second reason I included this, because this is, of course, I'm not sure if this actually is the car specifically being driven by not Adrian Sutil, but oh God, what was his name? The Dutch guy, Christian Albers. So this might have been the car that was the center of attention in the. It was either the French or the German Grand Prix where we had the infamous hose incident when Christian Albers left the pits with this fuel hose still attached, ripped the whole fucking hose out, and drove a good distance away from the pit lane before he realized what had happened. And then he drove one more race for Spiker and then was fired. And to be fair, I don't think it was the hose incident that caused him to get fired. I think he was just running out of sponsorship money, so that's why they fired him. And he was hired, and he was replaced by this complete nobody called Marcus Wilkenhock, who I don't think after that season even drove in F1s. So it was a cute time. It was a cute time with cute little teams like Spiker. And I like the name Spiker with a Y, by the way. Okay, so. Lewis Hamilton came into the sport in 2007, almost won the championship, just lost it barely to Kimi Räikkönen. It was a very, very dramatic end of the season. And it would have been a great opener for Hamilton were it not for this gentleman. Because McLaren's excellent performance in 2007. Remember, McLaren had been struggling because of their unreliable cars, but in 2007 they were bringing their A game. Scandal was afoot, and it involved this gentleman over here called Nigel Stepney. Nigel Stepney was a former Ferrari engineer. He was up for a promotion at Ferrari, didn't get it, and he was super pissed about it. So he started this very, very scummy plan. He started selling Ferrari's technical plans to McLaren. So McLaren decided to cheat, and word went to FIA. And what ended up happening is that if you look at Lewis Hamilton's and Fernando Alonso's standings in the Drivers' Championship, they stand. Hamilton is, of course, second in the championship. If you look at the Team Championship, McLaren is at the bottom of the board because the team was disqualified from the Constructors' Championship because the FIA wanted to punish the team, not the driver. Now, McLaren, of course, are a huge, rich F1 organization, so it didn't hurt them, but it definitely was an embarrassment, and they did not gain any, like I said, they didn't gain any of the TV revenue, so anything that they had to do for 2008, they had to do out of their own pockets, plus they had to pay that fine, which was several $1 million. So, at the end of the season, things were a bit chaotic at McLaren. So, Lewis was the new golden boy. He was definitely looking like he was going to have a good, as people probably know, he has been having a really good F1 career now. It was a great thing for Raikkonen, obviously, to finally win that championship because he had been driving for several seasons with McLaren with no luck of getting the championship. But there were two kind of dark sides to this season, and one was the whole Spygate scandal with Stepney and McLaren and all that. And for me, you got to remember, this guy was driving against this guy during those early years before 2007. And so Ferrari and Michael Schumacher, everything about this whole combo disgusted me. I hated them. I hated Schumacher. I hated Ferrari. So when Kimi went over to Ferrari, for me, it was like Kimi had gone over to the dark side. So I kind of did not get a lot of pleasure from him winning the championship. For me, it was a Pyrrhic victory because it happened in a Ferrari. Even though, statistically, and I realize this is completely unfair towards Kimi because he, like I said, he was not the favorite to win that championship, and yet he did. But Kimi came out surprisingly strong at the end and won the championship. And Alonso did not like being the number 2 driver to a rookie. So in 2008, things changed. So Alonso's not here. So what happened was that Alonso went. We will see him in a bit. But Alonso went back to his old team at Renault. And in 2007, there was this Finnish kid called Heikki Kovalainen who joined the show. His first season at Renault was okay. Nothing great, but okay. But now suddenly there was an open seat in McLaren, so here's Heikki. So he went to McLaren. All right. 2008, so Lewis lost the championship by the slimmest of all margins in 2007. In 2008, he came back swinging, winning races, and it was going well. Kimi Räikkönen did not have such a great start to the season. Instead, it was his teammate, Felipe Massa, who actually got a much better start to the season. And because of that, Massa and Hamilton were the favorites for the championship. And listen, if you want to see what true heartbreak is, like, go to YouTube and check 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix. So, Massa, who unfortunately would go down in history as kind of being the eternal number two, not his own fault, I would say. But this was his year. This was the year he was in contention for the championship. And Hamilton was, of course, eager to win his first championship. And there was only a few points difference between them in this championship. In the Brazilian Grand Prix, which was the last race of the season, Massa won the race. And he became and he was a champion for barely a minute. Then Hamilton, who was down a few positions, he hadn't had a good race. He managed to, at the last second, pass Timo Glock's Toyota, that was having problems. He passed, got up one position, and got 1 point more than Massa. And the TV footage of that is like super, super sad. Like this photo, this is a Photoshop, but this is from after the race was over and Massa found out that he had not won the championship, and he had tears in his eyes and he was beating his chest, and that was the most crushing defeat in Formula One history, like real drama shit. So that's why 2008 was such a great season. That for once it was the guy that nobody gave two craps about, and the Golden Boy fighting for the championship. It was a solid season for them. It was also a good season for Heikki. When Heikki came into McLaren, I kind of had like my new hero, to somebody to like champion on. Like I knew he wasn't going to beat Lewis, but he got off to a really strong start in 2008. And this is the picture from Hungary when he won his only race during his career. So Heikki's career started off really well. Unfortunately, it was all downhill from there, as we will see. Oh yes, and this picture is, you will recognize this kid, this German kid. This is Sebastian Vettel. Now this was not his first season. Sebastian Vettel actually debuted the previous year, actually for BMW. And again, drove very well as a substitute driver. And then moved to Toro Rosso, which is Red Bull's little junior team. And this was the year he won his first race. It was in Monza, in Italy. He won his first race. I only remember that because I was looking up I was trying to look up the photos for when these things happen. I knew it happened this year, but I didn't remember which race it was. But yeah, this was a huge deal because Toro Rosso had only been around since 2007 actually. So I don't think in 2006 I think they were still minority. I might be wrong about that, but they were a complete like backlot, tiny team at the back. Nobody cared about them, and then this German kid comes in and wins a fucking race for them. So that was a big deal for them, okay? And you can probably guess that this launched his, of course, career towards going into driving to Red Bull eventually. And then, last little picture down here, this sad little white and red car. This is a Super Aguri. Super Aguri debuted, I think, in 2006. Yes, in 2006. And 2008 was the year that they folded, I think, 3 or 4 races into the season. And it was kind of the beginning of the end of the Japanese teams in Formula One. To be fair, Super Aguri was not a good team. They were a horrible team, and that's why they ran out of money and had to end their racing. They were a Honda customer team. But it still feels bad. It's still, even for the little guys, I always feel bad when the F1 teams like fold. It never feels good to me. But anyway, 2008, really dramatic season. A lot of stuff happened on this season. All right, then we come to 2009. This was one of the most unusual seasons in Formula One history. And a big reason for it is the gentleman over here. So this is Jenson Button. Now, I mentioned the downfall of the Japanese teams, and actually 2009 was the last year we had Japanese teams in Formula One. Because, okay, I mentioned Super Aguri. They were a Honda customer team. Now, Honda had its own team around this time. It was formerly known as British American Racing, but then they bought the full rights to it. And they did a really poor job of running that team. In 2008, they did get one podium. They lucked out in the British Grand Prix, and Rubens Barrichello, who was a former Ferrari driver, actually got a third-place podium for that. So that was their one shining moment in 2008. But they had not been performing well, and they wanted to get out of F1s. So, at that time, Ferrari's former technical head, Ross Brawn, was working for them. And he knew that things were going badly. But in 2009, there was going to be this huge upset in the rules. And every once in a couple of years, the technical rules for F1 change. Usually it means that it's the whole playing field gets leveled. And Ross Brawn knew he had a really good car, but Honda was pulling out. So he negotiated with Honda that he wanted to keep going with his team. And he wanted that car to race. And Honda decided, even though they were pulling out, they decided, well, he wants it so badly, we'll let him. And they sold the team for I think around, I might be remembering incorrectly, but I think they sold the F1 team, the whole F1 team, staff and all, for about $1 million, which is fucking chump change. It's like buying a car for $50. So Ross Brawn managed to get the team, had no sponsors, obviously, so everything was coming out of his own pocket, probably, and very, very quickly signed a deal with Mercedes, who were McLaren's engine providers. And by the way, important note, at this point in history, Mercedes did not have their own F1 team. They were very much in a long-term relationship with McLaren. So they signed that Mercedes deal to get the engine so that they had an F1 team. And they just called it Brawn GP because they didn't have any sponsors or anything. And Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello continued driving for them. They even took a pay cut because literally they did not have enough money to pay them for anything. And from the beginning, they dominated the first half of the season. They almost won every goddamn race. And Jenson Button, who had been considered an okay driver at this point, he got hit a few podiums, but he wasn't considered he was not considered a serious contender for the championship. All of a sudden, this team, this nobody team with this nobody driver, is beating everybody. Okay, and it was part of the reason was that Ross Brawn discovered something about the diffuser, which are the aerodynamic parts at the back of the car. He came up with a design that made the car way faster than everybody else's, and that gave the team a huge advantage. Okay, guess which teams did not do so hot in 2009? That's right, McLaren and Ferrari's cars were a complete mess at the start of the season, and they were not in contention at all, which opened the gate for this gentleman. You've seen him before. This is Sebastian Vettel, and the Red Bull team suddenly had a realistic chance of fighting for the championship. And I say realistic chance, Brawn did win almost all of the races at the start of the season, and they had a huge points advantage by the middle of the season, by which point the other teams had noticed what they were doing differently with their car and copied the design, and then the gap started to shrink. Now, I don't unfortunately have his picture here, but Lewis Hamilton did wonders for McLaren. McLaren had a really bad start to the season, but towards the middle of the season, Hamilton managed to close the gap a little bit. McLaren were still far behind. But yeah, it was mostly Brawn versus Red Bull, and to be fair, it was very one-sided in favor of Brawn. But Vettel gave it his best shot. Like he tried his damnedest to catch up to Button, but I think Button still secured the championship like a race or two before the end of the season. And Button's championship, I unfortunately subsequently has gotten a lot of criticism that yeah, of course he won the championship. He had the best car. Well, duh. Usually the champions have the best car, but that's not the point. The point was that Button also drove very well because his teammate, Rubens Barrichello, was behind Vettel at the end of the season in points. So it was a great last like hurrah for Barrichello though, so I have to give him like props for that. So this was like a crazy, crazy season. And Ferrari never really fully recovered. Towards the end of the season, like Kimi Räikkönen was doing slightly better, catching up in the points, but Ferrari really never got its act together during 2009. And also, the other pictures here, it was an extremely dark year for Formula One's as a whole. Now, I already hinted at the, there was the Spygate scandal, which was pretty bad. There was the heartbreak of 2008, which was, quite dramatic. Super Aguri leaving, I kind of sad for me, maybe more personally than anything else. Okay, but this shit, I tried not to make this picture too big because if you look at this picture, you can find higher quality images and then you'll see what's going on there. So this is Felipe Massa after his accident in the middle of the season, which took him out for the rest of the season. So Rubens Barrichello, there was a practice session, I think, or possibly it was a qualifying session, and a spring or some part of Barrichello's car suddenly came off at high speed and hit Massa in the forehead. Okay? And it cracked his fucking helmet and his skull. So he obviously survived, but he needed surgery because it fucking cracked. It cracked his skull right above his left eyebrow, and it even caused a change in the design of the F1 helmets. They put a lot more extra padding on the forehead area, and so Ferrari were not doing well. And then they lost one of their drivers, so Ferrari never really recovered from the embarrassment. Like McLaren eventually did recover. And then there is this. Now this photo, I think, is actually from 2008. 2009 saw another gate scandal. So we've had... No, actually, I didn't show it, but in 2005 there was something called Tiregate. I'm not going to explain that. But then in 2007, we had Spygate. And in 2009, we had Crashgate. Now say this picture is actually from 2008. So here's Alonso. And this is obviously the Renault pit crew. And here's Flavio Briatore, and the man in the middle is Nelson Piquet Jr. So Nelson Piquet Jr. debuted in 2008 at Renault, son of former F1 champion Nelson Piquet, obviously. And then in 2009, in the middle of the season, he was fired. He was fired because his performances were not so good. And once he got fired, he went to the FIA and said, hey, guess what? In 2008, we had the first Singapore Grand Prix. Remember how I crashed out of that race? Yeah, I did that on purpose. Yeah. Flavio told me to crash my car so that Fernando's race position would get better. And, that, of course, telling a driver to crash is, you can probably guess that that's not a good thing to do. And it was, immediately the FIA took it under investigation, and it caused Flavio Briatore to be booted out of Formula One. Originally, they gave him a lifetime ban from the sport, or later they had to rescind that, but he has stayed out of the sport since then. And it threw the whole Renault team into a complete tailspin. They weren't doing super hot at that time anyway. They were kind of running out of money. And now their reputation was being dragged through the mud because of Crashgate. And also Piquet Jr. left Formula Ones, never raced in F1s again, but he did go on to eventually win the Formula E, the inaugural Formula E championship when that happened, when that series started a few years later. And yeah, and Renault has had some chaotic years subsequently after this. They've had a few good moments. We're about to get into actually one of the good moments. But yeah, at the end of the 2009, Jenson Button was at the top of the world. Sebastian Vettel had become a serious contender. And Renault and Ferrari were both kind of in a shitter. And this guy decided that he had had enough. He was going to get out. He had to get out of Renault. Where did he want to go? Well, where he obviously wanted to go was Ferrari. But there was already a guy at Ferrari. So then there was this bank called Santander, and they paid an insane amount of money to Kimi Räikkönen to leave Ferrari. Like, enough money to, like, buy his own country. So, Kimi Räikkönen left Ferrari. Fernando Alonso went into Ferrari. Felipe Massa obviously came back. At the end of the season, BMW left Formula Ones, and the team became Sauber again. Robert Kubica lost his job and went to Renault. At the end of the year, Toyota closed down its F1 team, and that left all of their drivers out of a job. One of them was a Kamui Kobayashi, and Kamui Kobayashi went to Sauber. Which was the former BMW, and Nick Heidfeld, I think, sat out for a while. Later went to Renault. There was a lot of shuffling around. So BMW left the sport, Honda had left the sport, Toyota left the sport. Lots of things happened. And Braun GP won the championship on their maiden season. That had never happened before for any constructor. And it was also their only season because Mercedes liked what they had done and so bought the team, and it became Mercedes GP the next year. So then we come to 2010, and there's a lot to unpack here. But 2010 was the last, like, one of my last favorite seasons, because this was probably the only season. Now, there have been close championship battles after 2010, but 2010 was the only season in my memory where there were 4 teams. Technically 3, but 4 teams, I would say, at the start of the season that were in contention for the championship. So, in 2009, Red Bull and Braun had gone head-to-head. Braun became Mercedes GP. Oh, yes, and because Jenson Button, who's a British driver, had won the championship, McLaren thought, hey, what if we hire this guy, have him drive with Lewis, and then we would have 2 British champions driving for us. So in 2010, I don't have Jenson's picture here, but Jenson Button and Lewis Hamilton were both driving. Yeah, I should have. I was supposed to put Jenson's picture here. So McLaren, Red Bull, and now Ferrari were all in contention for the championship. And Mercedes technically were as well. So Mercedes bought out Braun. Jenson went to McLaren, and because Mercedes is a German car company, they decided, hey, let's get some German drivers all up in here. There was a guy called Nico Rosberg who was up for grabs, and then they did something really awesome because Ross Braun, of course, was Ferrari's former technical lead. He was good friends with a certain Michael Schumacher, and they thought, hey, let's drag Schumacher out of retirement and get him in the car and have him drive again. And while Schumi probably thought that was kind of cool, I think in hindsight he probably would have preferred to have stayed in retirement because he did not do so hot that year. And Nico Rosberg wasn't really considered a good driver at that point. He eventually would go on to win a championship, and then promptly retired from Formula Ones. Good call. But at this time, he actually started to become a serious race driver, in my opinion. He had decent performance. But he was considered at that point, he had that reputation to be that rich kid who only got into Formula Ones because his dad won the championship. His dad, by the way, was Keke Rosberg, who was the first Finnish Formula One champion. and his son would eventually win it in 2016. Okay, but this is actually one of my favorite seasons, and also this is when I started my current blog. So I have a lot of documentation about this season, including about every single race. So Sebastian Vettel was sort of in contention for the championship, but really didn't have a chance in 2009. 2010, he was in serious contention, and what made Red Bull such a good team is, okay, they were a Renault customer team, so they had the Renault engine, and I don't even if you don't know anything about cars, you probably know that, a Renault engine, it's not as powerful as a Ferrari or a Mercedes. But that's the whole point. Like, Red Bull had the best car design, so they didn't need the fastest engine because they had a car with better cornering. Overall, just a much more competent on the road, on the track, the race circuit. So that gave them a huge boost. But it was a very close fight, and even Vettel was very, very close. There was a really bad accident in Spa where he really embarrassed himself and almost let Fernando Alonso and Hamilton completely catch up to him and beat him. But he did win the championship, and that was a great, great moment because he hadn't won the championship again. So that was a great. We had 4 seasons, and each season we had a different champion, and this was really beautiful. I really love this battle they had here. And here we have, of course, I didn't want to leave him out of the contention because he was in the championship top 3, I think, that year. Mark Webber, so Vettel's teammate, the Australian driver. Mark Webber, sadly not in Formula Ones anymore, and he left a few years after this because he kind of got sick of being the number 2 driver at Red Bull, which is sad. But he was great Formula One career overall. And 2010 was also kind of a cool season because we had 3 new teams enter the sport. Like I said, bunch of teams left, bunch of teams started. Sadly, none of these teams are around anymore because all of them kind of turned out to be a bit of a disappointment. This is Lotus Racing. He later became Caterham, but this was Hispania Racing Team. This was the first one to fold in 2012, and then this team was called Virgin. Next year, it became Marussia, and then later on, Manor. So yeah, and Heikki ended up driving for these guys, and it was really not a good time. Heikki Kovalainen from McLaren ended up driving here, being replaced by Jenson Button, and it was not a good time for him. I love the design. I absolutely love this green. I love these green designs. I always thought the Caterham cars looked slick as fuck. Too bad they were slow as molasses. So not a good team. But Hispania or Marussia at one point actually had Daniel Ricciardo, the Australian driver, who eventually would follow in Mark Webber's footsteps into Red Bull. He started off in one of these 2 teams, but I actually forget which one. I thought it was Hispania, but it might have been Marussia actually. And sadly, no real future talents came out of out of Caterham, unless you count Marcus Ericsson, who's the Swedish driver who then went on to drive for several years at Sauber, didn't do anything. Timo Glock sadly ended up here, ended up retiring. Jarno Trulli, who drove for a couple of seasons here, ended up retiring. Vitaly Petrov, who drove very well for Renault for a while, in 2012 sadly got sidelined, ended up in Caterham, and then nothing. Yeah. And there were a bunch of nobodies who drove for Hispania Racing Team. It was really kind of sad. Including Narayan Karthikeyan, who was the first Indian driver, and the second Indian driver ever. Karun Chandhok also drove here. So it was an interesting year for drivers and teams and things, and closest championship ever, which is why I like this. Why I like this season. And Jens, I have to say, it was also the last great season for Jens, because I think Jens kind of fell in the shadow of Hamilton in the following years, and then in the shadow of Alonso, because they, of course, were going to be teammates later. And later on, Vettel, of course, went to Ferrari as well, and Schumacher would retire at the end of the 2012 season. And as much as I hated Schumacher during his Ferrari years. I will say I kind of felt sad for him for driving at Mercedes because he was getting his ass kicked. Because he had spent 3 years away from Formula One and had not been doing any active racing during that time. So obviously he was out of shape and not fit to driving those cars. But there was this one really moving moment in his final season in F1. He managed to be third. A third place. He achieved a third place podium at some race. I forget which race it was. But the guys who joined him on the podium, one of them was Fernando, and one of them was Kimi Räikkönen, who at that point was driving for Lotus, not this Lotus, but the Renault team that had become Lotus at that point. And there are these really nice pictures of them together. And Schumi was also, he was in tears because it was like a nice little relief because his comeback to the sport had been such a disappointment. But yeah, those were my favorite Formula One seasons. And and when Schumi left, Hamilton went into Mercedes, and that's where he's been driving ever since. And Fernando Alonso, sadly, no longer in F1s after he had a kind of a bad run with McLaren later on. So those were my favorite F1 seasons. I hope you found this little stream interesting. I'm Hannu the Honda Mäkinen. See you on the next one. Bye bye.